There's a specific kind of silence that falls over a place when you don't belong there. I felt it the second I pulled my Ford F-150 into the circular driveway of the Oakmont Country Club. The valet, a kid no older than 20, froze halfway to a silver Porsche, staring at my truck like I had just driven a garbage rig into a cathedral. I didn't care. I was there for my daughter, Chloe. It was her 3rd wedding anniversary, and in my haste to check on a delayed foundation pour at one of my commercial sites, I had forgotten to give her the gift I'd prepared. It was a silver locket that belonged to her grandmother. I stepped out of the truck. I was wearing my usual worksite attire, a faded denim shirt, sturdy Levi's, and a pair of scuffed, steel-toed Red Wing boots. Dust from the construction site clung to my cuffs. At 62, I had long stopped dressing for the approval of strangers. My late husband Arthur and I built Hayes Holding from nothing but sweat, grit, and a second mortgage. I knew exactly who I was. But my son-in-law, Richard, had a very different opinion. Before I even reached the marble steps of the clubhouse, Richard stepped out from the glass doors. He was wearing a custom-tailored navy blazer and a Rolex that cost more than a starter home. When he saw me, his jaw tightened so hard I thought his teeth might crack. Chloe was right behind him, looking elegant but painfully thin in a white sundress. "Mom," she said, her voice small, a sudden panic in her eyes. I held up the small velvet box and smiled. "Hey, sweetie. I know you're having lunch with Richard's partners, but I wanted to drop this off. Happy anniversary." Before Chloe could take another step, Richard put a rigid hand on her arm, holding her back. He stepped down to meet me, closing the distance so the valet wouldn't hear. But his voice was still a vicious, slicing whisper. "What do you think you're doing?" Richard hissed, his eyes raking over my dusty jeans and stopping at my boots. "I'm giving my daughter a gift, Richard." "You are humiliating me," he spat. "My senior partners are inside. The board of directors is inside. And you show up looking like a day laborer? Richard," Chloe whispered, looking down at the pavement. "Please, she's my mother." "She's a peasant," he snapped, not even looking at her. He turned his cold, dark eyes back to me. "I've worked too hard to secure my place at this club to let you ruin it by parading around like white trash. We have a dress code here, Margaret. You are banned from these premises. Get back in your truck and go eat at a roadside diner where you belong." I looked past him, locking eyes with my daughter. "Defend yourself, Chloe. Tell him to stop." I willed her to speak, but she didn't. She just wrapped her arms around herself and looked away in shame. That broke my heart, but it didn't break my spirit. I didn't yell. I didn't make a scene. I just slowly lowered my hand, put the velvet box back into my pocket, and nodded. "Message received, Richard," I said, my voice perfectly level. "Enjoy your lunch." I turned, walked back to my truck, and climbed in. As I drove away, watching them in the rearview mirror, I didn't cry. Instead, I looked down at the pale, dry dirt clinging to my work boots. Richard called me a peasant. He thought I was poor. What my arrogant son-in-law didn't know was that the dirt on my boots was the exact same soil his precious country club was built on. 30 years ago, Arthur and I bought the 40 acres that currently housed Oakmont's back 9 holes, including the legendary 18th hole, and their $1 million parking lot. And my commercial lease with the club was set to expire in exactly 48 hours. The drive to downtown Fairfield gave me time to let the initial sting fade into something much more productive. Cold, calculated clarity. By the time I walked into the mahogany-lined office of Tom Ruskin, my longtime lawyer and oldest friend, the dust on my boots was the least of my concerns. Tom was 60, with silver hair and a mind like a steel trap. He drafted the original Oakmont lease for Arthur and me 3 decades ago. "Margaret," Tom said, looking up from his mahogany desk, surprised. "I didn't expect you today. What's going on? You look like you just swallowed a lemon." I sat down in the leather wingback chair. "Tom, pull up the Oakmont Country Club lease." Tom frowned, adjusting his glasses. "The commercial land lease? I sent them a reminder notice a month ago about the expiration date. They never replied. I assumed you were going to let it roll over into a month-to-month grace period, like we usually do with long-term tenants. Not this time," I said. "The lease explicitly states that if no renewal is signed by midnight this Sunday, all rights revert to the landowner, correct?" Tom typed swiftly on his keyboard. "Correct. Section 4. Clause B ironclad. But Margaret, Oakmont's 18th hole and their entire valet parking lot sit on your dirt. If you terminate the lease, you're effectively shutting down half the club. That is exactly what I intend to do." Tom leaned back, steepling his fingers. He knew me well enough to know I didn't make rash decisions. "Did Richard do something?" I gave him a tight, humorless smile. "Let's just say he decided to enforce the club's exclusivity policies a little too aggressively at the front gate." Tom sighed, rubbing his temples. "I never liked that kid. Always wearing suits that cost more than his car, always talking about synergy and optics. Actually, I'm glad you came in. I was going to call you tomorrow. About what? Tom pulled a notepad toward him. Richard called my office twice last week. He didn't ask to speak to me. He spoke to my paralegal. He was asking highly specific questions about the Hayes Family Trust. Wanted to know the exact clauses regarding how Chloe's future shares are structured and who holds the voting rights. A cold chill ran down my spine. The Hayes Family Trust held the bulk of the commercial properties Arthur and I had developed. Chloe was the sole beneficiary after my passing, but until then, I had absolute control. Why would a private equity VP care about a local real estate trust? I murmured, my mind racing. I don't know, Tom said, his tone serious, but sharks don't circle unless there's blood in the water. If you drop the hammer on Oakmont, it's going to start an earthquake, Margaret. You sure you want to do this? I pulled out my phone and dialed the number for Dave, the foreman of my heavy machinery division. Tom, I said, keeping my eyes locked on his. I'm 51% of Hayes Holding. I didn't build an empire by letting little boys in tailored suits bully my daughter or me. Dave picked up on the second ring. Dave, cancel the equipment transfer to the Stamford site. I need 3 bulldozers and a backhoe fueled and loaded on flatbeds by Sunday evening. The countdown had begun. The next morning, Saturday, I was sitting at my kitchen island drinking black coffee when I heard the familiar hum of Chloe's Mercedes pulling into the driveway. I braced myself. I loved my daughter more than anything in this world, but watching her shrink herself to fit into Richard's shallow mold had been agonizing. When Arthur died 5 years ago, Chloe had been devastated. Richard swooped in, playing the strong, decisive protector. By the time I realized he was systematically isolating her, they were already married. Chloe walked through the back door. She looked exhausted. The dark circles under her eyes were barely hidden by expensive concealer. Coffee, I offered, keeping my voice gentle. No, thank you, Mom, she said, hovering awkwardly near the door. I came to apologize for yesterday. At the club. You don't need to apologize for his behavior, Chloe. He was just stressed, she blurted out, stepping into the kitchen. The defense was automatic. Rehearsed. His private equity firm is evaluating him for a full partnership. The partners were there. You know how they are about appearances. You caught him off guard, looking like a construction worker. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I am a construction worker, Chloe. A developer. It's the money from that dirt that paid for your Ivy League education and the down payment on the house you and Richard live in. She flinched, looking away. I know, and I'm sorry, he's just under a lot of pressure. She opened her designer tote bag and pulled out a thick manila envelope, placing it on the granite counter. Anyway, he asked me to bring this to you. He said Tom's office is too slow, and we need to get these updated for the end of quarter tax filings. Just standard family tax updates. My eyes dropped to the envelope. The cold chill from Tom's office returned. Tax updates? I asked casually. Yeah, my accountant needs them signed by Monday. If you could just sign the tab pages, I can take them back with me. Leave them, I said smoothly. I'll read them over and have Tom send them directly to Richard's office on Monday morning. Panic flashed across Chloe's face. Mom, no. Richard said he needs them this weekend. Please. Just sign them. Don't make this a fight. If I go home without them, She stopped herself. But the terror in her eyes was all I needed to see. My blood boiled. He wasn't just verbally abusive. He was terrorizing her emotionally. Okay, sweetheart, I said softly. I'll look at them right now. I slid the envelope toward me and pulled out the thick stack of legal paper. I flipped past the cover sheet, ignoring the yellow sticky notes that said sign here. I read the actual legal heading on the 3rd page. It wasn't a tax document. It was an irrevocable assignment of proxy and voting rights. If I signed this, I would be granting Richard Sterling the legal authority to act as the primary decision-maker for Chloe's portion of the Hayes Family Trust. He was trying to trick me into handing him the keys to my kingdom, using my terrified daughter as his delivery boy. I looked up at Chloe. She had no idea what was in her hands. She was entirely blind to the trap her husband had set. I need to make a copy of this for my records before I sign. I lied smoothly. I'll drop it off at your house tomorrow. Tell Richard not to worry. Sunday night, 11:45 p.m. I sat alone in the home office Arthur and I had shared for 20 years. The house was dead quiet. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. On my desk sat 2 documents. On the left, the fraudulent proxy assignment Richard had tried to trick me into signing. On the right, the original. Yellowing commercial lease for the 40 acres of land beneath the Oakmont Country Club, signed by Arthur Hayes and the club's founders 30 years ago. I ran my fingers over Arthur's signature. We built this, Artie, I thought. We played by the rules. We worked until our hands bled so our daughter would never have to worry. Richard thought wealth was a zip code. He thought power was a tailored suit and the ability to humiliate a woman in front of a valet. He was a Wall Street parasite who produced nothing, built nothing, and felt entitled to everything. He wanted to ban me from his country club? Fine, I looked at the clock. 11:58 p.m., I picked up my cell phone. I had already sent Tom a scanned copy of the proxy document. Tom's reply had been a single text message. This is criminal fraud. Do we go to the police? Not yet, I had replied. First, we make him bleed. The grandfather clock began to chime. Midnight, Sunday was officially over. The lease was dead. The 40 acres of prime Fairfield County real estate, including Oakmont's multi-million-dollar parking lot and their pristine 18th hole, legally reverted to my absolute control. They were trespassing on my land. I dialed the number. Yeah, boss? Dave's gravelly voice answered over the roar of diesel engines in the background. Are the boys ready, Dave? I asked, standing up and looking out the window into the dark night. 3 dozers, 1 backhoe, and a crew of 6. We're parked a mile down the road from the Oakmont gates, just waiting for the green light. I smiled in the darkness. The lease just expired. Start the dozers, Dave. It's time to do a little landscaping. Monday morning, 6 a.m. The air was crisp, and a light mist hung over the perfectly manicured fairways of the Oakmont Country Club. I sat in the cab of my F-150, sipping coffee from a thermos. In my rearview mirror, a convoy of yellow heavy machinery idled, their diesel engines purring like caged beasts. All right, Dave, I said into my two-way radio, take the backhoe to the edge of the 18th green. Have the dozer start ripping up the asphalt on the south end of the VIP parking lot. Keep it safe, keep it legal. We are entirely on our own property. Copy that, boss, Dave replied. Chuckling, I watched as the massive Caterpillar bulldozer rolled off the flatbed. Its steel treads crunched onto the pristine blacktop of the parking lot, and with a deafening scrape, it dropped its blade. Chunks of expensive asphalt ripped upward like cheap carpet. Over at the 18th hole, the backhoe sank its teeth into the lush, imported Bermuda grass, tearing a massive, ugly trench right through the fairway. It took exactly 4 minutes for the chaos to begin. A golf cart came flying over the hill, its electric motor whining in protest. The club manager, a frantic-looking man in a green blazer, leaped out before the cart even stopped moving. He was waving his arms wildly, his face purple with rage. Stop! Stop right now! Are you out of your minds? He screamed over the roar of the engines. He ran toward my truck and pounded on the driver's side window. I'm calling the police. You can't do this. I calmly lowered the window. Good morning, Gary. I wouldn't bother with the police. This is private property, and I'm simply starting renovations. Gary blinked, recognizing me from the decades I'd quietly handled the lease paperwork. Mrs. Hayes? What are you talking about? This is Oakmont. This is Hayes Holding Property, I corrected him, handing him a thick legal folder. The 30-year lease expired at midnight. There is no grace period. I'm building a commercial parking garage. Before Gary could hyperventilate, a sleek black Range Rover skidded to a halt near the clubhouse. 2 men got out. One was Julian Vance, the 65-year-old president of the board, a man born into old money, with a posture as stiff as his collar. The other man was Richard. My son-in-law Richard looked furious as he stomped across the ruined grass, ready to assert his dominance. But as he got closer and saw my faded denim shirt through the truck window, he froze. The blood completely drained from his face. I took a slow sip of my coffee, looking right into his panicked eyes. Hello, Richard, I said smoothly. I told you I was a construction worker. Care for a tour of my new site? An hour later, the diesel engines were temporarily silenced, and I was sitting in the mahogany-paneled boardroom of the Oakmont clubhouse, the very building Richard had banned me from 48 hours ago. I hadn't changed my clothes. I sat in my work boots, flanked by my lawyer, Tom Ruskin, who had arrived with a briefcase full of documents. Julian Vance sat at the head of the long table, a pair of reading glasses perched on his nose as he scrutinized the original 1994 lease. Richard paced the length of the room like a caged animal, his tailored suit suddenly looking very restrictive. This is extortion, Richard snapped, pointing a trembling finger at me. Julian, you can't take this seriously. She's throwing a tantrum because of a minor misunderstanding at the gate. A minor misunderstanding? I raised an eyebrow. You called me white trash and told me to eat at a diner. But that's beside the point. The point is, I own the dirt you're standing on, Richard, and I want it back. Julian took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked at Richard, then at me. Mrs. Hayes, Oakmont has been a staple of this community for a century. Surely we can negotiate a renewal. Name your price. It's not about price, Mr. Vance. Tom Ruskin interjected smoothly. Mrs. Hayes has filed the permits. The land is being repurposed. Richard slammed his hands on the table. You can't do this. You have no idea what you're ruining. The acquisition deal depends on that land being secured under a long-term lease. The room went dead silent. Julian slowly turned his head to look at Richard, His aristocratic features hardened into a mask of pure ice. What acquisition deal? Julian asked, his voice dangerously low. Richard swallowed hard, realizing his mistake. Julian, I meant future valuations. General club equity. Don't lie to me, Richard. Julian stood up. I've heard rumors that your private equity firm was poking around, looking to privatize the club, but you swore to the board last month that you were only acting as a financial advisor. What deal? I looked at Tom. Tom opened his briefcase. It was time to pull the curtain back on my son-in-law. Tom pulled out a thick stack of papers and slid them across the polished table toward Julian. Allow me to clarify, Mr. Vance, Tom said. My office received this draft agreement from an anonymous whistleblower at Richard's firm last week. It outlines a $50 million leverage buyout of Oakmont Country Club by Sterling & Co. Private Equity. Julian's face turned ashen as he flipped through the pages. They want to bulldoze the historic clubhouse, build a commercial resort, a water park? Exactly, I said, leaning forward. Richard wasn't protecting the club's exclusivity when he banned me from the gate on Friday. He was protecting his commission. He knew the land lease was expiring. If the board found out he didn't secure the 18th hole, his $50 million deal would collapse. He panicked. I turned my gaze to Richard, who was now backed against the wall. You didn't want me talking to Julian or the board, I said, the pieces of the puzzle clicking perfectly into place. You needed to isolate me so you could slip that fraudulent proxy document through my daughter, hoping I'd sign away my land rights without reading it. Julian looked disgusted. You used your position on this board to orchestrate a hostile takeover from the inside. You were going to sell out our heritage for a promotion. Oh, grow up, Julian! Richard suddenly snapped, dropping the sophisticated act, his face twisted into a sneer of pure arrogance. This club is a dinosaur. It's bleeding money. My firm is bringing it into the 21st century, and I'm going to make partner doing it. Richard turned to me, adjusting his cuffs, his confidence returning like a disease. You think you're so smart, Margaret? Bringing your little tractors out here to scare me? He let out a dark, mocking laugh. You're one step behind, mother-in-law. You always have been. I didn't need you to sign those tax documents, Margaret, Richard said, walking back to the table with a terrifying swagger. That was just a backup plan, a courtesy. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a folded piece of heavy stock paper, and tossed it onto the table. It landed right in front of me. You see, your precious daughter isn't just a trophy wife, Richard smirked. She's also the sole heir to the Hayes family trust. And last night, while you were plotting with your lawyer, my sweet, obedient Chloe signed a full, irrevocable transfer of her voting rights and future equity to me. My heart stopped. I looked down at the paper. At the bottom, in blue ink, was Chloe's familiar, looping handwriting, her signature. Notarized. As the legal proxy for the heir to Hayes holding 50% of the future interest, I am filing an emergency injunction this morning, Richard declared, his voice ringing with triumph. I am suing you for intentional destruction of company assets. A judge will halt your bulldozers by noon, and I will force the renewal of this lease through arbitration. Tom tensed beside me, reaching for the paper, but I didn't move. The legal threat wasn't what paralyzed me. It was the signature. My own daughter had signed away the legacy her father and I had bled for, handing the sword to the man who was actively trying to destroy me. You manipulated her, I whispered, the maternal rage burning in my chest. I managed her, Richard corrected coldly, just like I manage portfolios. She's weak, Margaret. She craves approval, and she'll do whatever I tell her to do. Now call off your machines, or I will drag your family name through the courts until you're bankrupt. I stared at his smug face. I slowly stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my denim shirt. The machines stay, Richard, I said, my voice eerily calm. Tom, we're leaving. As I walked out of the boardroom, I didn't look back. I had a daughter to visit. I didn't bother knocking when I arrived at Chloe and Richard's massive, sterile modern mansion in Greenwich. I used the spare key she'd given me years ago. I found Chloe sitting on the floor of her pristine white kitchen, her knees pulled to her chest, crying silently. When she saw me, she flinched, a physical, defensive movement that made my stomach turn. Mom, she choked out, her face pale. Richard called me. He was screaming. He said you brought bulldozers. He said you were trying to ruin us. I walked over, ignoring my dusty boots on her expensive marble floor, and sat down right next to her. I didn't yell. I pulled the copy of the proxy document from my pocket and laid it gently on the floor between us. Chloe, I said softly, did you read what you signed last night? She looked at the paper, tears spilling over her cheeks. He said it was just wealth management. He said I wasn't smart enough to handle the trust when you pass away. He said if I loved him, I'd trust him to protect our future. She broke down, burying her face in her hands. The floodgates opened, and the ugly truth poured out. The financial abuse. The fact that Richard had secretly put her on a strict allowance. The constant belittling of her intelligence, isolating her from her friends, making her believe she was nothing without his guidance. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed, trembling violently. "I was just so tired of fighting him, Mom. I just wanted peace. And now I've lost everything. I gave him Daddy's company. I ruined your life's work." I reached out, pulling my daughter into my arms. I held her tightly, stroking her hair just like I did when she was a little girl who scraped her knee. "Shh," I whispered fiercely, kissing the top of her head. "You didn't ruin anything, sweetie. You made a mistake because you were scared. But you are a Hayes." Chloe sniffled, looking up at me with red, swollen eyes. "But he has the proxy, Mom. He has the lawyers. He said he has us trapped." I wiped a tear from her cheek and gave her a smile as cold and hard as the steel toes in my boots. "Oh, my sweet girl," I murmured. "You and Richard both underestimate your parents entirely too much." Tuesday afternoon, the dust from the torn-up asphalt at Oakmont's 18th hole was still settling when my phone rang. The caller ID displayed an unknown number. "Mrs. Hayes," a crisp, aristocratic voice said. "This is Julian Vance." I leaned back in my office chair. "Mr. Vance, calling to threaten me with another lawsuit." "Quite the opposite." Julian sighed, the usual stiffness in his tone replaced by exhaustion. "Can we meet privately?" An hour later, I was sitting across from Julian in a dimly lit old-world speakeasy in downtown Fairfield. He nursed a neat scotch. I had black coffee. Despite our differences, he was old Connecticut money, and I was a woman who built her fortune mixing concrete. We suddenly shared a common enemy. "Richard is accelerating his timeline," Julian said quietly, keeping his eyes on his glass. "Since you initiated the demolition, his private equity firm is panicking. They're hosting the annual Oakmont Gala tomorrow night. Richard plans to use the event to publicly announce the $50 million buyout to the entire membership, presenting it as a rescue package to save the club from your construction. He's going to use the proxy my daughter signed to assure the investors that he controls the land." I concluded. Julian nodded. "He's brilliant at spinning narratives. Once he announces the deal in front of his senior partners and the press, the board will be pressured to accept it. Oakmont will be gutted and turned into a corporate cash cow." Julian looked up at me, his eyes sharp. "I despise what these young Wall Street sharks do to institutions with actual history. I want him gone, Margaret, but my hands are tied. He has the proxy, and legally he has a fiduciary duty to the trust now. How do we stop him?" I reached into my bag and pulled out a manila folder, sliding it across the table. "Julian," I said, a slow smile spreading across my face, "how would you like to help me deliver a little history lesson?" Julian opened the folder. He read the first page, his brow furrowing. Then he read the second page and his eyes widened. He looked up at me, an expression of pure, unadulterated shock on his face. Slowly, that shock morphed into a wolfish grin. "My God, Margaret," he whispered. "No," I corrected gently. "My husband and I just built a very solid fence. Richard is the one who decided to climb it." Julian reached into his jacket and pulled out a gold-embossed envelope. "The gala is tomorrow night at 8, he said, handing me the VIP invitation. "Dress code is strictly black tie. But for you, Mrs. Hayes, I think we can make an exception. Wednesday night." The Oakmont Country Club Grand Ballroom was a sea of glittering diamonds, tailored tuxedos, and the suffocating scent of expensive perfume. I stood in the shadows near the grand entrance, flanked by Tom Ruskin and Julian Vance. I hadn't worn my work boots. Tonight, I wore a perfectly tailored charcoal pantsuit, a strand of Arthur's pearls, and a pair of sensible black heels. I looked exactly like what I was. The CEO of a multi-million-dollar real estate empire. Through the glass doors, I watched Richard holding court. He was in his element, holding a glass of champagne, surrounded by 3 older men, the senior partners from his private equity firm. And standing slightly behind him, looking like a ghost in a stunning emerald gown, was Chloe. My heart ached to see her looking so small, so terrified. Richard occasionally put a proprietary hand on the small of her back, a gesture that looked affectionate to the room, but I knew was a physical command to stay perfectly still. "It's time," Julian murmured. We waited until Richard stepped up to the podium at the front of the ballroom. The string quartet faded out. The room of 300 wealthy elites quieted down as Richard tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed members of Oakmont, and my distinguished partners at Sterling & Co." Richard began, his voice oozing with polished charisma. "We stand at a crossroads tonight. As you know, a temporary dispute with a local landowner has threatened the integrity of our historic 18th hole." A murmur of concern rippled through the crowd. "But fear not," Richard smiled, raising a hand. "I am proud to announce that Sterling & Co. has secured a $50 million capital injection to not only resolve this land dispute but to purchase Oakmont outright. ushering our beloved club into a new era of luxury and profitability. Polite applause began to build. The senior partners nodded in approval. Richard was seconds away from crowning himself king. Then, Julian Vance signaled the sound engineer. A sharp blast of feedback screeched through the speakers, cutting the applause dead. The heavy double doors of the ballroom swung open. I walked in, my heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. Tom and Julian walked right beside me. The crowd parted for us like the Red Sea. Richard's confident smile faltered, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the podium. "Security," Richard barked into the microphone. "Remove this woman immediately." "Stand down," Julian's voice echoed through the room. He stepped up to the front, taking a secondary microphone from a waiter. "Mrs. Hayes is my personal guest, and as president of the board, I have an announcement of my own." The ballroom was dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. Julian looked directly at the senior partners of Richard's firm. Sterling & Co. has presented a buyout offer predicated on the acquisition and renewal of the 40 acres comprising our 18th hole and parking facilities. Mr. Sterling assured the board, and presumably his firm, that he had secured legal control of this land. "I do," Richard shouted, his composure shattering. He frantically waved at one of his lackeys, who rushed up and handed him the proxy document. Richard held it up like a shield. "This is an irrevocable proxy," Richard yelled to the crowd, his face flushed. "Signed by the sole heir of the Hayes family trust. I control the assets. I control the land. She's just a bitter old woman trying to make a scene because I told her she looked poor." Gas echoed through the room. The mask had slipped. Richard had shown his true ugly colors to his billionaire bosses. I calmly walked up the steps to the stage. I didn't look at Richard. I looked at my daughter. "Chloe," I said softly, extending my hand. "Come here." Richard turned on her, his eyes blazing. "Stay exactly where you are," he hissed. Chloe trembled. She looked at Richard, the man who had controlled her every move for 3 years. Then, she looked at me. I gave her a small, reassuring nod. "You are a Hayes." Chloe took a deep breath, lifted her chin, and walked past Richard, taking my hand. The rage on Richard's face was terrifying, but he was powerless to stop her in front of 300 witnesses. I stepped up to the microphone. "Richard," I said, my voice smooth and loud enough to fill the hall, "you are very good at reading financial projections. You're very good at bullying young women. But you are remarkably bad at reading county property deeds." I turned to Tom. My lawyer opened his briefcase and pulled out a single certified document with a heavy gold seal from the state of Connecticut. He handed it to the senior partner of Richard's firm, who was standing near the front row. "What is this?" the partner asked, adjusting his glasses. "That," I said into the microphone, "is the deed to the 40 acres of land beneath this club." I turned back to Richard. He was sweating now, his eyes darting frantically. "You see, Richard, my late husband and I put our commercial buildings into the Hayes family trust to protect Chloe's future," I explained slowly, letting every word sink in. "But the raw land, the dirt beneath Oakmont?" I paused, watching the realization hit him like a freight train. "Arthur knew how much I loved that dirt," I smiled. "So 30 years ago he didn't put it in the trust. He deeded it to a separate independent LLC, Margaret Holding LLC. I am the sole owner. It is 100% my personal property. It has absolutely nothing to do with my daughter, and nothing to do with the trust." The color drained from Richard's face entirely. He looked down at the proxy document in his hand. "That piece of paper you coerced my daughter into signing?" I said softly. "It gives you control over office buildings in Stamford. It does not give you one single grain of dirt at Oakmont. Your proxy is completely worthless here." The senior partner from Sterling & Co. looked up from the deed. His face was a mask of cold corporate fury. "Is this true, Sterling?" the partner demanded. "Did you leverage a $50 million buyout on land you don't even control? Did you lie to the firm?" I can fix this," Richard stammered, stepping backward. "I can sue her. You can pack your desk," the partner said icily, turning his back on him. "The deal is dead, and as of this moment, so is your career at this firm." Julian Vance stepped up to the mic. "And as for your membership at Oakmont, Richard, your locker will be cleared out by morning. You are permanently banned from these premises." The aftermath was a blur of poetic justice. As the senior partners stormed out and the crowd began to loudly whisper among themselves, Richard stood alone on the stage. The arrogant, untouchable Wall Street shark was suddenly a man with no job, no deal, and no country club. He looked at Chloe, desperate. Tell your mother to stop." "We're family." Chloe stood tall. She didn't cry. She reached into her clutch, pulled out the 3-carat diamond ring he had used to claim her, and dropped it onto the podium. It landed with a sharp clink. "I'll have my lawyer send the divorce papers to whatever apartment you can afford now," Chloe said quietly. She turned and walked down the stairs with me. We didn't run. We walked out with dignity, leaving Richard to his ruin. Outside, the cool night air felt amazing. Julian Vance walked us to my car. He looked at me, a genuine smile on his face. Margaret, that was the finest display of corporate demolition I have ever witnessed. Thank you, Julian. He cleared his throat. So, about the bulldozers. Are you really going to build a parking garage? I looked at Chloe, then back at Julian. I smiled. Have your lawyers call Tom tomorrow. I think we can negotiate a new lease. On my terms. 6 months later, the divorce was finalized quickly. Without his high-paying job and facing a massive lawsuit from his former firm for insider fraud, Richard didn't have the funds to fight. He moved out of state, a ghost of the man who once cared so much about his tailored suits. Chloe moved back to Fairfield. She started working with me at Hayes Holding, learning the ropes from the ground up. Watching her regain her confidence, her voice and her spirit was the greatest return on investment I had ever received. As for Oakmont, I didn't build a parking garage. But I didn't give them back all 40 acres either. I signed a new lease with Julian and the board. They kept the 18th hole and a smaller VIP parking area, paying a premium market rate. But the remaining 10 acres, the beautiful wooded area bordering the main road, I kept for myself. I was standing on that land now, wearing my faded denim shirt and my scuffed, steel-toed Red Wing boots. The bulldozers had finished their work. Instead of asphalt, they had cleared paths for a public botanical garden and walking trail. A stone archway stood at the entrance, welcoming anyone from the community free of charge. No dress codes. No exclusivity. Chloe walked up beside me, handing me a cup of black coffee. She was wearing jeans and sneakers, looking happier than she had in years. Looks good, Mom, she said, looking out over the fresh soil and new saplings. It does. I agreed, taking a sip of the coffee. I looked down at the dirt covering my boots. I smiled. Power didn't come from a membership card, a zip code, or a shiny watch. True power came from knowing exactly who you are and owning the ground you stand on. And my ground? It was finally perfect.